You see a headline about another conflict breaking out somewhere in the world, and you feel a familiar, tired thought settle in: war again. As if it's simply what humans do, as if it always has been. But the real answer to when humans first went to war is far stranger, and far more recent than you have been led to believe. For most of human existence, there was no war. Not peace in some gentle, storybook sense, just an absence of the thing you assume has always defined us. Start with a question that sounds almost too simple to matter. What actually counts as war? Not a single act of violence between two people, not one group member killing a rival in a moment of rage. War means organized, coordinated violence between groups, planned in advance, carried out by multiple people working together against another community. That distinction turns out to change everything. For decades, a popular story circulated in both science and pop culture. It said humans have always been at war with each other, that our closest primate relatives prove violence is baked into our biology, and that peaceful societies are simply rare exceptions waiting to break down. This story felt intuitive. It also turns out to be built on far shakier evidence than most people realize. Here is where the real investigation gets interesting. Archaeologist Marta Mirazon-Lar led a team that examined one of the oldest suspected sites of intergroup violence ever found, a location in Kenya called Nataruk. There, researchers uncovered the remains of at least 27 individuals showing signs of violent death, some with what appeared to be blunt force trauma to the skull, others with wounds consistent with projectile weapons. The site dates back roughly 10,000 years. That number matters enormously. Anatomically, modern humans have existed for well over 200,000 years. If the oldest strong evidence for group violence appears only 10,000 years ago, that means humans spent the overwhelming majority of their existence, more than 95% of it, without clear evidence of organized warfare at all. So what changed around 10,000 years ago? This is where the story becomes less about human nature and more about human circumstance. Around that time, something enormous shifted in how humans lived. Groups that had spent nearly 200,000 years moving, following food, following seasons, following herds, began settling down. Agriculture emerged, people began storing surplus grain, people began building permanent homes on land they intended to keep, and for the first time in the story of our species, there was suddenly something concentrated, defensible, and worth fighting over in a fixed location. Researcher Stephen LeBlanc has spent years studying the archaeological record of early settled societies, and his findings paint a consistent picture. Once humans began settling in one place and accumulating stored resources, evidence of organized conflict increases sharply. Fortified settlements begin appearing. Defensive walls begin appearing. Weapons designed specifically for use against other humans, rather than for hunting animals, begin appearing in the archaeological record with far greater frequency. This is the part that should genuinely surprise you. War does not appear to be an ancient, unavoidable expression of human nature stretching back to our origins. War looks like a technology, one invented alongside farms and granaries and permanent walls, born the moment humans had property worth defending and a surplus worth stealing. But there is a complication to this story, one that pushed scientists to dig even further back, past our own species entirely. In the 1970s, primatologist Jane Goodall was observing a community of chimpanzees at Gombe stream in Tanzania when something unprecedented happened. The community split into two rival factions. Over the following years, Goodall documented something she never expected to witness. Members of one faction began systematically hunting down and killing members of the other, in what researchers now refer to as the Gombe chimpanzee war. This single observation reshaped an entire scientific debate. If our closest living relatives are capable of coordinated, lethal violence between groups, does that mean this capacity has been sitting in the shared ancestor of humans and chimpanzees for millions of years, long before Nataruk, long before agriculture, long before any of it? The honest answer is complicated, and that complexity is exactly what makes this question so fascinating. Chimpanzees clearly possess the biological and behavioral capacity for coordinated intergroup violence, but possessing a capacity is not the same as constantly expressing it. Bonobos, chimpanzees' equally close primate cousins, share almost the exact same evolutionary lineage, yet display dramatically lower rates of intergroup violence, resolving many conflicts through social bonding and cooperation instead. Same underlying capacity, wildly different expression, depending entirely on social structure, resource pressure, and circumstance. This is exactly the pattern researcher Lawrence Keeley uncovered when comparing violence rates across small-scale nomadic societies versus settled, resource-concentrated ones. Keeley found enormous variation. Some nomadic groups showed almost no evidence of intergroup conflict for generations. Others, particularly those competing over increasingly scarce resources, showed patterns of raiding and violence that could, by some definitions, qualify as a primitive form of war. The capacity for coordinated violence appears to be old, likely older than our species itself. But the expression of that capacity, whether it appears constantly, occasionally, or almost never, depends heavily on something else entirely. Population density, resource scarcity. Whether there is something fixed and valuable enough in one place to make organized violence worth the enormous risk. Think about what this means for the story you have probably absorbed without questioning it. War is not a switch flipped on at the dawn of humanity, sitting there this whole time waiting to be expressed. War looks more like a pressure valve, one that stays mostly closed when resources are abundant and mobile, and one that begins opening as soon as resources become scarce, fixed, and worth defending. This reframes something you have probably felt yourself, even in situations that have nothing to do with actual violence. The tension that rises in a workplace the moment resources become scarce, when promotions are limited, when budgets shrink, when everyone senses there is suddenly not enough to go around. The way cooperation, generosity, and openness tend to increase when people feel resources are abundant, and tend to collapse into suspicion and self-interest the moment scarcity becomes real. You are not imagining this shift. You are watching the same ancient pressure valve respond to the same ancient conditions, just in a modern, bloodless form. There is a modern twist to this story that makes it even stranger. Consider how quickly humans today form group identities, even over things with zero actual survival stakes. Rival sports fans developing genuine hostility towards strangers wearing a different colored jersey. Online communities splitting into hostile factions over disagreements that from the outside look almost meaningless. Researchers studying group psychology have found that humans form in-group and out-group loyalty with startling speed, sometimes within minutes, based on nothing more than an arbitrary shared label. Your ancestors evolved this rapid group bonding instinct for extremely practical reasons, coordinating hunts, sharing food, defending against real threats. But the underlying wiring never learned to distinguish between a genuine survival threat and an arbitrary modern grouping. It simply activates the same ancient us versus them machinery regardless of the stakes involved. This is why online arguments over topics with no real consequence can escalate with a hostility that feels wildly disproportionate to what is actually being discussed. It is why people can feel a genuine surge of anger on behalf of a group they only nominally belong to. None of this requires actual scarcity or actual danger. It only requires your brain recognizing a group boundary, something it has been extraordinarily good at detecting for a very, very long time. So the next time you see a headline about conflict somewhere in the world, or feel an unexpected flash of tribal loyalty over something as small as an online disagreement, understand what is actually happening beneath the surface. You're not simply witnessing an ancient, unavoidable feature of human nature finally showing its true face. You are witnessing a very old capacity for group loyalty and group defense, largely dormant across most of human history, being activated by very specific, very modern conditions. You see a headline about another conflict breaking out somewhere in the world, and you feel that familiar, tired thought settle in. War again, as if it's simply what humans do, as if it always has been. But it isn't what humans have always done. For nearly 200,000 years, your ancestors moved, shared, and survived without it. War arrived late, arrived alongside walls and granaries and things worth defending, and it has been quietly waiting for scarcity and boundaries ever since, in you, right now, more often than you'd ever expect.